Welcome back, Richard. You're back in a dark room in a different space for today's podcast, but it's good to see.
Well, you know, a little variety.
That's right.
It's end of the month variety.
That's right.
You know, it's close to the end of the month again.
Yeah,
we're like days away from October.
This is the last podcast for September, so yeah, the next one will be October 3rd.
They're just flying by again.
Yes, they are, and it seems like I know that everybody feels busier and busier every day. There's just so many things going on, so many things to do, and but it's good to see you.
No, we talked about worrying about remember a few months ago, it seemed like just yesterday we were worried about the start of school and having all the kids return to school. And now we're close to we're just weeks away from the first 9 weeks being over.
Yep.
You know,
it's flying.
It's flying by. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But today
what's today's topic?
Well, we're going to talk about thoughts and feelings a little bit today.
Okay.
And you know, this kind of comes from a couple of different places. You know, we were recently asked to write a book chapter for the best practices in school neuropsychology. It's going to be a page turner for everybody who listens to this podcast. It's
the book is, or the podcast is?
The book.
The book is the page, right?
Yeah, but it's real specific to school psychologists and talking about different ways to evaluate. But we in the book we're writing the chapter on emotional disorders, emotional disabilities, but also because this is an issue and topic that we discuss with our patients many times, and that is about thoughts and feelings and how they relate to our mood and everything else that's going on in our lives.
Right. Yeah. When we were first talking about the book chapter, because as you see, our topic was emotional disorders, and it was immediately evident that the first thing we'd have to do before we talked about evaluating emotions is defining them. You know, what are we talking about when we talk about emotions? And at first, you think, well, that's a simple enough thing. Emotions are these things. Well, there's a great deal of controversy. Yeah. In fact, it's over 100 years old. The controversy between emotions and feelings and thoughts, and which ones come first, and you know what exactly is an emotion and what exactly is a feeling, and are emotions and feelings the same things? So we knew that we'd have to sort through all that, and the same thing happened here, is we knew that we'd have to sort through it. So that's where we want to begin, is trying to differentiate feelings and emotions. And the other thing was, why do we have trouble managing our emotions? You know, what are they? And why do some people occasionally have trouble managing their emotions. Other people have chronic problems in managing their emotions. It's like their emotions take over. And why does that happen? And finally, what should we do about it?
Right.
Okay.
So the goal of the podcast today is to kind of do two things. One is to sort of differentiate between some of these things, because people tend to sort of interchange the words thoughts and feelings and emotions and use them interchangeably, like they all mean the same thing. And so we're going to differentiate them just a little bit, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some ideas on how to best manage them.
Right.
Right.
And we found this one little article called and what is the difference that explains the differences. Right. And there is a link in the show notes to that particular article.
Right.
And if you go through chapters and articles and explanations by different people, everybody sort of has a different take on a different definition of what these things are. And it's challenging just to get definitions that sort of make sense to us. Okay. Right. And so this particular writer, her name is Laura Gemme, Gemme, differentiates emotions from feelings and feelings from thoughts.
Right.
And I think it's sort of a useful way of, so not the only way, but it's a useful way of differentiating emotions, feelings, and thoughts.
Right. So we'll start with emotions and the way that she describes emotions. She describes them as physical reactions, either to things going on in our environment that are sort of external to our body, or things that are going on inside our body. You know, there are many things besides thoughts, which we'll talk about in just a second. There are many things that happen within our body that affects our emotions. You know, if you have an upset stomach, if you have a headache, if you're hungry, you know, a lot of those things can be internal, but affect and have an impact on our emotions.
Right. And in fact, one writer, when he said only that emotions are chemical releases.
Right.
It has nothing to do with, it's just a biological event that occurs in your brain or body. And he says emotions are just chemical releases. It's a release of chemicals. Okay.
Right.
And so you can see immediately that there's something just biological, instinctual, obligatory about emotions. They just get released, and not the emotion, the chemical gets released.
Right. And in that way, emotions are often referred to as precognitive.
Right. That's right. That's right.
And so what we mean by that is they are, as you said, they are these chemical releases that happen without you having to think about it.
Right.
They just happen. And
Right.
once they occur, we have that sensation of that release of chemicals, because we would experience that, we would feel that by either you know, oftentimes something changes in the way that our body is behaving.
Right.
You know, if you have a panic attack, for example, those chemicals are flooded into your system and you might freeze and suddenly you can't move. It's not because you're deciding not to move, it's because you are unable to move.
The chemicals make it, right.
Right. And so once we have that physiological experience, we interpret that. We internally in our minds, I suppose, we process what that feeling is like, and then we assign it a name.
That's right. And we name it. Right.
The name that we assign it is called a feeling.
Right. Exactly. Right. Yeah, because our bodies are constantly being impinged on, affected constantly by something in the outside environment, the things that we see or hear or smell or feel, and also from our internal environment. We have aches and pains and memories. Okay. So there's stuff that comes internally and affects us. There's stuff that comes from our environment that affects us.
Right.
And all of those things cause a chemical release. And the
Right.
chemical release is emotions.
Right.
Once the emotion gets produced, once the feeling occurs, then we name that, we identify it. Oh, this is fear. Oh, this is anger. Oh, this is love. This is kind. And it's the naming it that occurs at a conscious level.
Right.
So as you say, emotions are subconscious, whereas feelings occur at a conscious level. It's our brain doing some things, interpreting something.
And if you think about the way that because we've often talked here on the podcast about how important vocabulary is, we use words to describe that, because we say, I feel anxious.
Right.
Well, what you're saying is that the sensations that I'm feeling in my body, I'm interpreting those as anxious. And so I feel anxious.
Right. And I'm pretty sure everybody feels this way when they feel anxious.
Right.
You know, we're reasonably sure that we all feel the same way.
Right.
But this is a problem with young children.
Right.
Because young children don't have the vocabulary to label their emotions accurately.
Right.
And that's why they often make mistakes when they react to things happening to them, because they're misidentifying the emotion.
And this is especially the case with boys, young boys, because boys are often taught, either directly or indirectly, that only certain emotions, certain feelings are acceptable.
That's right.
And so if they experience something different, that is often squashed or redirected pretty quickly. Right. Or what happens is the vocabulary that they use, or the labeling of those feelings, is often done incorrectly. Right. Or you look angry. you must be angry. You need to stop being angry. You need to, and so now whatever it is that that child is feeling at the time, they're going to label that as anger, even if it's sadness, even if it's disappointment, even if it's fear, they're going to label it as anger. And then that's going to be how they then process those feelings, the physiological response to those emotions. That's how they're going to label that from then on.
Right. And so this idea of naming the emotion and naming it accurately is absolutely critical to doing something about it. Then the third thing are thoughts.
Right.
And thoughts it's our thoughts that shape our feelings, that help us understand and name the feelings. Thoughts come from our background, our temperament, our cultural background, our family background, our religious background. All of those things affect our thoughts, and our thoughts in turn affect our feelings. Okay.
Right. So if you put these together, you can see how different people respond to different things in different ways, all the different ways. So for example, you go and you go to a theme park and you're standing there in front of a roller coaster. You're going to have thoughts, and those thoughts are based upon your experiences and your beliefs and your ideas. And you may look at that roller coaster and say, that looks exciting. Or you may look at that roller coaster and say, that looks scary.
That's terrifying.
Now you go and get on that roller coaster, and you're going to start having physiological emotions. Those emotions are going to start preconscious based upon your thoughts, that sort of foundational belief structure that you have. You're going to interpret those emotions in different ways.
Right.
Now, many times, and this is what we really work on a lot with patients, many times the emotions, what you're feeling physiologically, many times we're all feeling it exactly the same way. We're all experiencing the same emotion. But based upon our thoughts and beliefs, we're going to interpret those emotions differently. And so we're going to have different feelings. So depending, with different backgrounds, some people are going to interpret those emotions as fear.
Right.
Others are going to interpret those emotions as excitement.
Right. Right.
Because they look at it and they say, oh, that looks fun. That looks exciting. So they're going to interpret those same emotions, that same physiological process. One was going to interpret it as exciting. The other is going to interpret it as fear.
Right.
And so that's how the three kind of work together to produce what it is that how we describe things and how we think about different things that happen in our life.
Right. Right. Now, where do these things come from? And why do we talk about separating emotions, thoughts, and feelings? Well, the reason is because the brain itself is an incredibly complex organ. I mean, it exceeds our capacity to really understand it, because it can do things that machines just can't do.
Right.
And probably will always be so. But there are a few constants when it comes to the brain. There are a few things that the brain does routinely.
Right.
And one of those things is all of these sensory inputs that we're talking about, all the stuff in the environment, it all enters the back of our brain. And that's where sensation occurs. We see, we hear, we feel, we touch. All of that comes into the back of our brain. Those sensations, those things that we see and hear and feel, then pass through the brain because they want to go to the front of the brain. They want to go to the farthest most point in the cortex in the brain, and that's in your right in your forehead, right under your skull. What happens though is that the journey from the back of your brain to the front of your brain passes through the limbic system. And when those sensations pass through the limbic system, they get emotional value. And so the example I would always use with my class is if you're walking across the room and you see an electrical cord, you step over it. But if you're walking across the room and you see a cobra, it produces a completely different set of emotions, okay? So all of our feelings, sensations, all of them are given emotional value as they pass through the brain.
That's right. And so that process again happens precognitive. Much of that happens. So in your example, if you're walking across and there's a cobra, you were jumping back and probably running away before you have actually processed in your brain that it's a cobra.
Yeah.
That limbic structure is such a fascinating region of the brain because it makes that decision for you.
Right.
It's like you don't have a choice.
Right.
It's almost like a reflex.
That's right.
In that you don't make the decision to run from the bear. You're just running from the bear.
Right. Exactly. You're running because somewhere in your brain it said, get out of here.
Right.
Okay?
Quick.
So as this information passes from the back of the brain through the emotional parts of the brain and to the front of the brain reacts in one of three ways. If something is life-threatening, if your brain decides that you're in danger, if something is life-threatening, the limbic system, the emotional structures of the brain, produce a very intense emotional reaction that triggers the fight or flight response. That's what you were talking about with dangerous animals or, an object coming in your direction. Somebody throws something at your head and you duck, or you hear tires squealing and you jump out of the way. Even before you have a chance to interpret what's going on, your brain reacts. It's a life-saving mechanism. Okay. We have daughters and I want my daughters to have a good fight or flight response.
Right.
If they get attacked, I don't want them to wonder about who it is. Just save yourself, get away from it. And that's the first thing that the brain will do. It will save your life. Okay.
Right.
Now, if the sensation, if what you see or hear or smell or touch is not life-threatening, then the information continues on its way to the frontal lobes. Okay. When it gets there, but the frontal lobes aren't going to manage everything.
Right.
And so along the way, things that aren't important get deleted. Okay. If your brain says, that's not important, we don't care about that. That stuff doesn't go to the frontal lobe, but because you'd overwhelm it. Okay. But everything else, so that's the second thing that happens is you have a, do I want to ignore this? Do I even want this to go to the frontal lobe to think about it? And some information is just not important enough, that it doesn't matter. So your brain sort of gets rid of it. It's like house cleaning, it gets rid of the clutter. Okay, we don't need to worry about this, so we're not going to do anything about it. People who can't do that, not people, brains that don't do that,
right,
create problems for us. And that's what we see with ADHD. People with ADHD don't have those filters. And so everything makes its way to the frontal lobes and you get overwhelmed because there's too much to react to. Okay. And that's what we see in children and adults with ADHD. They just can't sort it out because there's too much information.
Right.
And then the third thing is because most of us are not in dangerous situations most of the time.
Right.
I mean, every once in a while we are, but day in, day out, most of us don't live unless you live in a war zone or you're living through a hurricane or a pandemic, maybe living through a pandemic. But unless you're in real danger, the environmental events that occur are kind of the normal ups and downs of daily living, an inconsiderate neighbor, a relative, a cranky child, a deadline, a presentation that we have to do. Or you have a memory, a bad memory of something. You're walking along, everything's good. I was telling you this morning that I had there was a time long ago when I had to miss one of these meetings, and to replace me, Berney got a balloon, got a white balloon, and drew a face on it, and that was me that day. Okay, and for some reason that popped into my head, and so that was a pleasant memory. Okay, but we can also have unpleasant memories, and they do the same thing.
Well, and this is where trauma comes in, and we'll talk more about that later. But there are times when, as that stimuli enters our brain from what we see or feel or hear around us, as that stimuli enters and goes through our brain and through the limbic system, sometimes what is triggered in the limbic system is danger because of some traumatic event in the past.
That's right.
And so again, it doesn't get to the prefrontal cortex, so you can make a decision and say, you know what, that was a balloon popping or a car backfiring. That wasn't a gunshot. I don't have to be afraid of that because it triggers that memory in our through our limbic system.
That's right.
The fight or flight response is triggered when it doesn't need to be.
That's right. Because the brain, these limbic structures don't care.
Right.
They don't care what it is. Their job is to keep you alive. And they're going to do that regardless of anything else.
Right. It doesn't matter.
But most of our memory, most of our emotions do go eventually to the frontal lobe because they're not life-threatening. Okay.
Right.
So they go to the frontal lobe. And when they go to the frontal lobe has the job of interpreting what they are. What is this feeling? What is this feeling that I have? Modulating it, regulating it. Is it important or not important? Do I want to deal with it or not? What do I want to do about it and with it? And then finally, the frontal lobe will generate a socially acceptable response.
Right.
Well, this is happening, so I will do this. This is happening, so I will do this. And so the frontal lobes interpret, and that's what we call feelings.
Right.
Okay, the interpretations of feelings. Modulation is emotional regulation.
Right.
We regulate our emotions. And our response is what we say or do in response to our feelings. Okay.
Right.
Now, but what happens is that with emotional disorders, when we use the term emotional disorder or emotional disturbance, there's some imbalance between the emotions that are produced and the ability of the prefrontal cortex to regulate them.
Right.
Okay. For most of us, about 80% of us, our prefrontal cortex is usually up, we say it's up to the task of emotional regulation. Things happen, stuff happens in our life, but we have enough emotional regulation to keep fear and anger and anxiety under control.
Right.
Okay. But 20% of us, or across our lifespan,
Right.
there's a 20% chance that we're going to get an imbalance. Something's going to happen that causes an imbalance. And about 20% of us have chronic imbalance. All right. So what do we do when things go awry? So we know how the system works.
Well, I think that something important to throw in there, though, is that when we're experiencing that, when we're having that sort of that imbalance in that response, we have to remember that our prefrontal cortex sort of has a very small gas tank, right?
Right.
So when you think about the ability of our brain to perform function, every region of our brain requires fuel. The limbic system, the emotional system in our body, in our brain, sort of has a bottomless tank. It just keeps going and going and going and going.
It's a nuclear reactor.
Right. And again, that's important because even if you're tired, you want you want your limbic system to keep you safe. So, suddenly, you could be exhausted, about to pass out. But if you see that cobra, you're going to suddenly have a ton of energy to get away. You may pass out afterwards, but you're going to have plenty of energy to get away. The prefrontal cortex has a very small, relatively speaking, a very small gas tank. And that's why in the evenings, especially, we are more irritable. We're more frustrated, more easily frustrated. We experience many more emotions, sometimes incorrectly, in the evening and at night, because we have been exercising and using up that fuel all day long. And so it's more difficult. And so thinking about kids work hard all day long. They're controlling themselves. They're maintaining their behavior all day long at school. And then they get home and they're having meltdowns and they're having all these difficulties in the evening at home. Well, they used up all of their prefrontal cortex fuel at school. Right. Now they're on empty. And so their prefrontal cortex can't modulate it as well as it could, throughout the school day. And that's why we see some of that happen in the evenings and in the nighttime.
Right. And so we have to keep in mind this idea of balance. That really helps if you keep in mind the balance between the emotions that are produced and the ability of the prefrontal cortex to control and regulate, modulate, moderate all those feelings. If you didn't have that, If we didn't have that, I mean, that's what differentiates humans from most other species,
Right.
is that humans have a much larger prefrontal cortex, so we can make these decisions. Most animals react on instinct. I
Right.
mean, they just react when they're hungry, when they're sleepy, when they're whatever's produced. They just react to whatever's produced. We have this other capacity, and that capacity exists in the prefrontal cortex. It's a decision maker. It's a decider.
Right.
But you're right. Limited amount of fuel. It's
Right.
usually running on fumes, whereas the limbic system is like a nuclear reactor. It's always active.
Right. And so that leads to where you were going a moment ago, where we get to these times then when things go awry, and they go awry because either the prefrontal cortex doesn't have adequate fuel to control it and maintain it, or when sometimes our limbic system is so sensitive because of past experiences or thoughts, we get back to thoughts there, those kinds of things, that it's so sensitive that it interprets many more things as important than are really important.
That's right.
Remember, you were saying earlier that our prefrontal cortex can get overwhelmed if too much information is sent to it. And that's the problem that we have with ADHD. For other people, the limbic system interprets so many things as important, as emotionally charged, sending so much information to the prefrontal cortex that it just can't modulate all of it. It can't control all of it.
That's right.
They get overwhelmed.
Right. Yeah. Let's take you mentioned panic attack a few minutes ago, and that's really a good example of the brain short circuiting, because what happens is, for some reason, either an external trigger or some internal feeling or memory gets triggered, and it starts this cascade. It starts this process all over again.
Right.
And if the emotion that it produces is big enough, is intense enough,
right,
the frontal lobe can't do anything, and it just you panic, and you go into panic mode, because you overwhelm the cortex. You overwhelm the brain's ability to control it, and for a few minutes you're out of control.
Right.
Now, you'll come back.
Right.
But those few minutes can be very scary. Very,
very scary. And the challenge that we have oftentimes is that we don't always know what causes that.
Right.
There are stimuli from our environment many times that trigger these responses in our brain that we simply have no idea. It could be, the perfume or cologne of somebody walking by, or it could be the sound that somebody made when they, were, next door, or, whatever. It could be lots of different things that trigger this. And it could be those external things, or it could even be internal things. So if you have a history of abuse, for example, and you're experiencing stomach problems in your abdomen or something, it could sort of subconsciously elicit some of those memories that's going to put you into this heightened state of lots of distress and lots of anxiety and just ill feelings as a result of something that you're not even necessarily putting together. You wouldn't necessarily think, I have a stomach ache, so it's triggering these memories from so long ago, and that's why I'm feeling like this. You're not going to necessarily put that together. Right.
Yeah, so all of us can experience, and we all probably have experienced, that feeling of our emotions kind of taking over for a while. Okay. But as we said earlier, about 20% of people, about 20% of us, experience more chronic emotional difficulties. And that comes in the form of depression, anxiety, fear, people who live in fear, people who are generally angry. It's just, they're angry and irritable most of the time. In these cases, emotions have sort of hijacked the brain. There's a famous quote, hijacking the amygdala. But emotions can hijack your brain and just take control. And so this balance falls apart. And now you have the emotions that are controlling everything. And that, as I say, occurs in about 20% of individuals. These are more serious problems. Okay. In these cases, the emotions are so intense that they generally, day in, day out, exceed the capacity of the frontal lobe to control them. Or there's something wrong in the frontal lobe that reduces its capacity
Right.
to regulate your emotions. Okay.
The fuel tank there is even smaller.
Is smaller, right? Or something is awry. And there's plenty of evidence for the last over 100 years that the frontal lobes are involved in this kind of thing. And if they're not working properly, your system is going to get hijacked. Okay?
Absolutely. And
so what do we do? What do we do? So as therapists, what we're constantly trying to do is, what do we do about the imbalance?
Right.
That becomes our challenge.
Right. And so the first thing that we really need to do, and we kind of alluded to this earlier, is the first thing we have to do is we have to correctly identify it. We have to correctly name what it is that we're experiencing. Because as we said earlier, the emotional piece, the physiological piece is going to be the same for most of us. Most of us are going to experience a similar physiological phenomenon. But the way that we name it, the way that we identify it, the way that we associate the feeling with that emotion is important, because that's going to help guide the process of correctly being able to correctly modulate it.
Right. I'll say, I frequently say to parents, they'll say, boy, when she does that, I just want to become abusive. It makes me so angry when she talks to me that way. But as you walk the parent through it, carefully peeling that, say, is it really anger that you're feeling? And if you take it apart, many parents eventually get to, well, no, my feelings are hurt.
Right.
I'm angry because she's treating me in this way, and it hurts my feelings.
Right.
Well, your reaction to having your feelings hurt is going to be very different from a reaction of being angry.
Right.
And that's why it's so important, because if you're just angry, you're probably going to lash out.
Right.
If your feelings are hurt, you're less likely to lash out.
Yeah, you're going to respond.
Don't turn it into anger. That's not anger you're feeling. Your feelings have been hurt.
Right.
Deal with what's really going on.
Absolutely. Now, once you have been able to correctly name it, and to be honest, as you were just saying, you sometimes you need someone on the outside to help you with that. Sometimes you need a therapist or someone to help you walk through that process, because it's not always intuitive. Because you certainly talk to people who, no matter what, they always come back to anger.
Yeah, I'm angry.
And it's like, you can see clearly that it's, disappointment or sadness, or that your feelings are hurt or something, but they always come back to anger. And so it takes a lot of work to do that. But once you've correctly named it, the next thing is to determine whether it's temporary, whether it's episodic, or whether it's a chronic problem.
Right.
So when it's temporary, of course, that means that as soon as the crisis is over, everything returns to normal and everything's fine. And that's the majority of what we experience.
Right. A tornado goes through town and you're scared to death for 10 minutes. And when it's over, then your body returns to normal.
Right.
That's temporary. Okay.
Right. But the next is episodic. And that's when we really have to pay attention. And again, you may need a therapist or someone to help you with this, but that's when the same feelings, emotions and feelings recur at a predictable time or place. Sometimes you don't always know what the trigger is, but this is when we get into sort of different phobias or something, like or panic attacks. I'm not sure what triggers it, but every time I walk down, aisle 7 of the grocery store, I get really anxious.
Right.
Okay, so that's episodic. So we know that it happens periodically, and it's a problem.
Right. And the other thing that happens is that I just noticed that it's daylight.
Yeah, it's getting to be daylight.
It's right now, I don't know what to do. The other thing about episodic is you frequently have college students, or, well, anybody. It could be college students, it could be kids, it could be adults, who come in and say, I'm always, it's not that they're always anxious, but anxiety keeps occurring.
Right.
Different things, but they always end up being anxious. Or some people they have recurring anger. They're angry with their children, they're angry with their spouse, they're angry with coworkers, they're angry that the car doesn't work. Everything gets turned into anger. And there's this recurring theme in their life. Okay. That's what we mean by episodic. It's the same feeling gets triggered by whatever event is occurring. I'm always angry. You know, dad's always angry. Mom's always sad. Your mom's always depressed. And so episodic problems are probably worth addressing with a professional. Okay. But certainly chronic problems.
Absolutely.
You know, when you're so depressed, when you're so anxious that it really starts to impair your life day in, day out, then you really have to do something about it. And that may be a different kind of problem. Still the same brain. It's just that now the emotions have taken over and they've really completely overwhelmed the whole system.
Right. So of the three, the temporary, episodic, or chronic, you know, with episodic and chronic, we certainly would want to encourage you to, you know, get some support and some help to deal with those.
Right.
Temporary is, again, it's very common. I mean, that's the way that we all experience it. But you may need some support with temporary issues simply because, you know, if your response to those temporary things is so extreme, so excessive, that it creates other problems. And so you may need to get some help there. But but the last part is to determine whether it is a problem in the limbic system or a problem in the cortical system, the prefrontal cortex. And that is, you know, are you producing too much emotion? Like, is it so much emotion that it's exaggerated for the given problem or the given situation? Or is it, or are the emotions and feeling, are the emotions sufficient or appropriate, but you're just applying too many feelings to it, too stronger feelings to it? And that would make it more of a cortical issue.
That's right. Because if it's limbic, as we said earlier, it's kind of subconscious. You know, it's coming from places that we don't control consciously.
Right.
If it's cortical, those are feelings. Those are things we are doing at a conscious level. Okay. And so one of the writers that you and I are reading her book right now, the Beyond Behavior.
Right.
And she says, if it's a limbic problem, she says that's bottom up. That's coming from bottom of your brain, coming up to the cortex. Or it might be that you can't regulate or you can't name properly. And that's a top-down problem. Okay. And so what she argues is that if the problem is a top-down problem, then you might be able to change your feelings by changing your thoughts.
Right.
Okay. But if it's a bottom-up problem, that may not work because it's not a conscious issue. It's below your consciousness. Okay. And when we talk about children, where this happens with children is that parents will come in and they'll say, well, I've tried rewarding and punishing him, doesn't work.
Right.
Well, the reason it doesn't work is because if you do a reward and punish system, you're counting on the child remembering that if they do this thing, they're going to get in trouble.
Right.
That's cortical. That's top down. That's I'm thinking about it.
Right.
Frequently, children have bottom up problems. They come from someplace else, and they're not going to respond to reward and punish because they're not thinking about it. It's beyond their capacity to think about it.
Right. And just a simple example, perhaps, of what we mean by the limbic system is producing too much emotion is, and this is maybe a silly example, but if you think of a person who maybe is afraid of snakes, being afraid of snakes is a normal, natural human condition. However, if the person, you know, goes into fight or flight, if there's a string on the floor, or every time they see any long, slender, you know, a pencil or a pen or a string or some wire, or if that produces a fear or panic attack every time they see that, because their brain is interpreting it as a snake, that's probably a limbic system issue. That's not a cortical issue, because they're producing that fear before they really even process it, because clearly there's nothing wrong with the string. But that's where the brain is producing too much emotion for the stimuli that's there.
Yeah, when we talk about people who have irrational fears, that's what we're talking about. That the fears are way beyond what they really should be, which means the limbic system is producing too much emotion. Okay, even before you get a chance to interpret it. Okay? Right. And so we have to be mindful of this of whether it's a thinking problem or if it's an emotion problem. Okay. The other thing about our thoughts and using our thoughts to change things is we have to remember that our thoughts have been shaped over many, many years. Even if you're a young child, you've had 10 years worth of thoughts. Okay, so,
Right.
I mean, even if you're little. So, but if you're an adult, you've had 20 or 30 or 40 years
Yeah.
of thinking, your thoughts have a history.
Right.
And if you have a 20-year history of thinking a certain way, it's no easy task to change that. I mean, that's not easy to change. You're talking about a 20-year habit. This is what I've been doing for 20 years. And now I'm seeing a therapist and he says, well, just change your thoughts. It's not that easy.
Right.
Right. And so, so if you've been thinking about something for 2 or 3 decades, or even longer than 2 or 3 decades, it may be difficult to change those thoughts. So you can do it, but it's probably going to take a lot of work and some considerable time. Okay.
Absolutely. So, and as you said, that goes for adults and children a lot.
Right.
It's a really difficult thing. So, again, as you go through this process and you're wanting to work on some of these things, the things that we have to really focus on is, what is the emotion?
Right.
Name it. What is the emotion? Name it correctly, identify the correct feeling that should be associated with it, and then identify what's creating the problem that you're having. Whether is it
where's it coming from? Why is this happening to me? Why do I get angry all the time? Why anger?
Right.
Not you're angry, let's do this, but rather why anger?
Right.
Okay. That's the important therapeutic question is don't say, well, you're anxious, so let's do this. You're anxious, so let's throw medicine at it. We talk about this all the time. You're anxious, so let's give you some medication to end your anxiety. Well, wait a minute. What is it really? First of all, is it anxiety?
Right.
Is that what you're really feeling? Remember the emotion wheel?
Yeah.
There's 320 feeling wheel. There's 320 feelings that you can produce. So first of all, is it really anxiety? And second, why anxiety?
Right.
What is it about you, your thinking or your feeling or your life experiences that create this particular feeling? First of all, is it accurate? Second, what's producing it?
Right. And when we have problems, when we have a problem with this, it plays out whether we have, when you're talking about people with ADHD or PTSD or, panic attacks and, autism and, just about every mental health condition that you can consider.
Right.
There is some dysregulation between the emotions and the feelings and the thoughts.
That's right.
And so, working through that process to figure out, what the issue really is and where the mishap is so that you can address and focus intervention and treatment in the right place is going to be critical.
Right. Yeah, we talk about these disorders like ADHD or PTSD, even autism, reactive, all of these things in one way or another relate to this imbalance. You take like autism. What is it about autism? Well, people with autism either don't interpret the events accurately. They either miss them altogether or they misinterpret them. Okay. And so the problem occurs at the interpretation level. That's subcortical.
Right. Well, the great comparison, I think, is ADHD. Is cortical. That's your frontal lobe isn't sufficient to modulate the emotions that are coming through.
Right.
PTSD and panic attacks, that's emotional. That's going to be limbic issue. Right. And so even with these conditions, you can see one has the issue in the cortical system, the other has the issue in the limbic system. And so your treatment for those things are going to be very different. At home, at school, in your daily life, it's going to be different depending on where it's coming from.
And that's why therapeutic approaches, therapeutic interventions don't always, it's like people say, well, let's use cognitive behavioral therapy or let's use dialectical behavioral therapy. Those are wonderful approaches if you use them for the right problem.
Right.
Okay. You just can't, you don't pick up a tool to solve a problem. You don't pick up CBT and say, well, I want this, let's use CBT. Well, let's use CBT if it's a top-down problem.
Right.
If we have to change thinking. But CBT isn't going to work if it's a bottom-up problem.
Right.
It may work, but it's going to take a long, long time, and you're going to have to do other things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it all goes back to, we have to correctly identify it.
That's right. Begins with that.
Absolutely.
As Dr. Silver said,
that's right.
Begin with the diagnosis. Got to get the diagnosis right.
That's right. So, all right. Well, I think that's it for today. The sun's up and it's time to get to work. So, all right.
Oh, that's something to look forward to.
Yes. So
that's exactly what's going to happen too. Now we have to go back to work.
That's right.
Okay.
All right. So that's it for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.